So the Lionesses have their hands on their first major trophy, but those involved in the women's game will be hoping their win and the tournament have a lasting legacy. And the signs are positive. As we heard, 17.4 million people in the UK watched the match on television, making the final the most watched TV programme of the year. Almost 6 million others watched online, meaning that around a third. When England's women last reached a major final in 2009, it was watched by just 1.4 million. Meanwhile, just over 87,000 people were at the match at London's Wembley Stadium. That is the record attendance for any European Championship final, men or women, beating the previous record set at a men's tournament in 1964. And research shows that interest in women's football has grown by 46% over the last decade, meaning it currently has a global reach of 330 million, and that is set to keep growing. But major inequalities remain when it comes to finances. Jenny Mitton is business director and women's sport lead at communications agency M&C Saatchi Sport and Entertainment. Welcome to the programme, Jenny. So this is, of course, a huge moment for women's football. Are we now at the point, though, where this is more than a moment and has turned into a movement, if you like?
We are, and actually I think we saw this coming before the tournament even began. If you look back to March, they had already sold out the final. That was before anyone knew who was going to play. I think they saw ticket purchases at general sale. About 75% were unknown to UEFA and the FA, and that's new fans, and that was, 4 months out the tournament. Now we're seeing the real cultural shift that I think you talk about. So this is where we see the pub chalkboards outside promoting the game. This is where we see fans up and down the country sharing Alessia Russo memes. Once you get more ingrained in culture and it becomes the norm and everyone's talking about it, then I think you can see you've made a genuine shift.
And we talked a little there about viewing figures in England, in the home country, but this is a final that's been watched worldwide. Looking at China, for example, some 70,000 people watched it there. Unlike the men's game, the women's game isn't historically necessarily popular there. Do you think this tournament is having a global impact?
I do, and I think we're going to see more. Surprisingly, there was 93 countries, so Europe and outside, who actually bought tickets. So not only tuning in, people are actually coming over to England to watch the games. And I think what's really interesting, England and Europe are known as a home of sort of European football, some of the best football in the world. And we know the Premier League attracts huge audiences from Asia and from Africa as well. And actually, a lot of those clubs have women's teams, and the brilliant players we've seen in this tournament will be going back to those clubs and playing week in, week out. So what's going to be interesting is seeing the uplift. So once people have got hooked onto the women's football, have found a player in the tournament they've loved watching, will they then go on to follow them in the domestic league?
Well, you mentioned there some of the brilliant players we saw. How has the tournament changed how brands and sponsors are responding to both these players and the women's game more broadly?
It's really interesting. There's quite a few long-term sponsors who have been in the game for a while. So you look at someone like Barclays, who sponsor the Women's Super League. They've been supporting women's sport and women's football for 10 years. And actually, they've made a huge pledge that by 2024, they're going to have every girl in England provide the access to them for football in schools. I think what's interesting is probably this week, we've seen a lot of sponsors jump on the bandwagon. So sponsors who we don't normally see get involved, big brands, putting out reactive ads, talking about the game. So I think we'll see quite a few of those sponsors post-tournament actually come into the space and look to have proper substantial deals.
So sponsorship is one thing. What about the money invested in women's football? Do you think this tournament and this victory for England will help reduce this gap between the men's and the women's game?
I hope so. We always talk about this gender pay gap that continues. I mean, you look at the prize money. The men, if they'd won the Euros last year, the team would have seen 5 million between them. Now the women's team will get 1.3 million. They've just brought football home to the UK. So clearly there's a huge disparity in work to be done. But I think what's really interesting, and I think where we'll see more money come into the game, is through the sponsors. And if you look at all the sponsors who sponsored, who are part of UEFA sponsor group, or the domestic sponsors, they're all premium brands, big names with big budgets doing brilliant things. We're not seeing sort of cryptocurrency sponsors or maybe second-hand car brands that we see in men's football. These are big brands with bigger budgets. So it'll be interesting to see how the sponsorship market grows now, because these sponsors have demonstrated that they can get return on value from getting behind women's football, and other brands will be taking note.
And a final word on the audience. Do you think, while this tournament has brought new people to the game, that those new viewers, that new audience, will keep on watching now that it's finished?
This is a huge challenge, and I think this is where we struggled with London 2012, engaging people post-event. Now, what's interesting, there is a huge legacy plan in place from UEFA and the FA, and we saw that, I think, even before the final, a lot of the Women's Super League clubs were promoting games. The first games of the season are going to be held in the men's stadium, so you can watch Man City women in the Stadium of Light. So I think, there is work that's already taking place. And what we hope we saw from the Women's Sport Trust around the 100, which is the domestic women's tournament, we saw that people who watched the 100 for the first time last year, 70% audience, then went on to watch another form of women's sport. So there is hope that women's sport does breed support, and a lot of that audience will then go and seek out more women's football for the WSL.
Jenny, great to talk to you today. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme. That's Jenny Mitton from M&C Saatchi Sport and Entertainment.